Dr. Gordon, thank you so much for your time, as always. I was quite taken by the introduction from this statement, which is headlined as Statement by Migration Scholars on International Labour Migration Situation in South Africa. And the opening few paragraphs states very clearly how important this grouping of scholars understands this data statement to be about the subject at hand, and how relevant it is, and how important it was for you to put it out there in a way that allows people to understand that this is not meant to dismiss the lived realities of so many South Africans who truly do believe that the bread on their table is being taken away by migrants, or a large number they believe to be of migrants in the country. Talk to us about that foundation statement and what was top of mind for you as you put this grouping of information together.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. You know, this statement from migration scholars in South Africa was led by Statistics South Africa. There was a deep concern that much of the debate in recent months is falsified on some very erroneous understandings of the issue of migration in South Africa. To draw your attention to one fact, we find that a large percentage of ordinary South Africans think there are tens of millions of international migrants living in the country. 35% of the population believes there are more than 25 million international migrants residing in South Africa. In fact, if we look at the established figures, there are only 4 million international migrants living in South Africa. And indeed, as Statistics South Africa conducts and finalizes the Census 2022, there is an expectation that we might find slightly less than the 4 million projected, maybe 3.95. So it is important, we believe, as immigration scholars, to bring some clarity to this issue and not to allow ourselves to be swept up in fanciful claims about the impact of international migration on South Africa. Often extreme statements are made about that impact. The numbers just don't back up.
Now, speaking of those numbers, some might listen to you now and say, oh, that's the 4 million that you know of. We're talking about the undocumented numbers in South Africa. And your statement says that there are erroneous suggestions that tens of millions of undocumented migrants reside in South Africa. In fact, you go further to say it's worth mentioning that many undocumented people enter the country in a documented manner, but are then unable to maintain this status. Explain to us what you mean by that.
Oh, of course. So people cross the South African border, enter South Africa in a perfectly legal manner, and then overstay the documented required duration, meaning that their stay in the country is longer than their documents permit, and they become irregular migrants until they can acquire new documents. And this is a potential problem for many people who come to South Africa for work and for business. It's important to add that while South Africa does experience a certain level of irregular migration, there is nowhere near the numbers often alleged. Human beings leave an indelible footprint in our nation, which is obvious to demographers through variety of different statistical variables. So for tens of millions of people to reside in the country without being detected is unfortunately quite impossible.
Now, let's turn our focus then to the issue of employment, or the lack thereof for so many South Africans. You quote a World Bank statement in 2018 that showed that every employed migrant in South Africa creates 2 jobs for South Africans. And indeed, Stats SA revealing that international migrants are more likely to be employed than internal migrants, but they're more likely to generally do work that does not conform to the decent work framework. Explain to us what that means in layman's terms.
No, absolutely. So if immigrants come to South Africa and engage in economic activity, they add to the economy. This generates jobs for ordinary people, both in terms of foreigners employing South Africans, but also in terms of downstream effects. Foreigners buying things within the country creates larger amounts of economic activity, which leads to economic growth, which leads to more jobs, and also a healthier fiscus as people engage in various forms of tax payments, including, of course, VAT. So this study was quite clear in measuring the effect of international migration on the South African labor market. It was backed up by a IOL study recently. Now, Stats SA has done their own work showing that foreigners who come here, they are employed, they are adding to the economy, they are generating economic productivity. However, because often foreigners are unable to access lucrative jobs in the formal economy, many of them take work in the informal economy. And as a result, they end up doing work which is characterized as indecent, unsafe, and quite exploitative. We should bear in mind that improving labor market conditions for everyone who lives in South Africa is extremely important, and this should be pushed for. All people who reside in South Africa should enjoy the opportunity for decent work.
Where does that leave us, though, going forward? Because the statistics really, these numbers really do speak for themselves, but does not fit with the massive belief out there that, firstly, that South Africa has a problem with undocumented migrants, and indeed that those migrants are the people taking the jobs away from South Africans. Is this where government really does need to step up to tighten up in terms of paperwork, to ensure that there's not that leeway between a documented worker being able to ensure that their paperwork stays up to date, so that there isn't that cloud hanging over them and indeed the community in which they stay? Where does it leave us, and what should government be doing?
Well, it is absolutely necessary for the Department of Home Affairs to engage in reform. And of course, they are planning a series of reforms, updates, new initiatives to improve the documentation process. But we should not be distracted by the regulatory issues. Scapegoating international migrants for jobs, for crime, for disease is a very, very dangerous road. International migrants are not responsible for these things. Depicting an entire group of people as parasitic criminals is the definition of prejudice. South Africa has a long history of prejudicing certain groups of people, and this leads to some very bad places. This leads to an authoritarian approach to many aspects of our lives, and it does not improve people's ordinary lived conditions to prejudice and victimize people who are residing in South Africa, many of them living honest lives, contributing meaningfully to the economy. We need to focus on the real sources of our unemployment problems, our criminal problems, and our socioeconomic ills, and not try and scapegoat a small minority of people who are just trying to do their best to build good lives in South Africa.
Very powerful note to leave it on. Thank you so much. That's Dr. Stephen Gordon of the Human Sciences Research Council. We thank you for your time this evening. As always, interesting statement put together there by migration scholars on international labour migration situation in South Africa. If you want to read in some detail, you can go to the Human Sciences Research Council's website, where I'm sure that is indeed published.